Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a principal customer engineer focused on management technologies. Today's discussion will be part 26 of an ongoing series that is discussing operating system deployment in Configuration Manager that is also part of Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Today's focus area will be on task sequence bootstrapping, and along the way, we'll also talk about the bulk registration token and also talk about an autopilot scenario where this can be used. All right, so here's our agenda. I want to talk about what task sequence bootstrapping actually is, why we care about it, and then focus on bootstrapping, talk about the requirements, level set on some terminology as we start to go forward, work through a few scenarios, talk about how each scenario works, configuring each scenario, and then finally seeing this work in action. We'll wrap up with some troubleshooting tips and tricks. So what is what is task sequence bootstrapping? Well, the first thing I should really say is with task sequence bootstrapping, what we're talking about is installing the Configuration Manager client, and then as part of that client install, rapidly calling and initiating a task sequence. Now, we'll talk about this in requirements again, but there are some things to understand. What that task sequence is going to do is up to you. Oftentimes, what you'll want to do is basically use that rapid initiation of the task sequence to initiate a baseline build on your operating system, right? So the idea might be that you start with the plain vanilla zero customization operating system that's on the device, and then through that rapid task sequence initiation, you can add some customizations on the fly when the client is getting installed, right? Now, there's a number of scenarios for this that it could be interesting in, right? So just think about a user pulling their device out of the box and turning it on for the first time, or rebuilding their device and installing the Configuration Manager client as a part of that rebuild for the first time. You can initiate a task sequence to customize the machine. Now, often when we think about task sequencing, we think about building an entire device from the ground up, including laying down the operating system. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about basically having an OS on the box already, and maybe installing the client, and with that client install, going ahead and customizing with a task sequence that is not a traditional imaging task sequence. It's a non-imaging task sequence, right? But the same concepts can apply, and we'll see that as we go along. Another, what is task sequence bootstrapping? Generic OS customization. So support customizing the device with a generic OS, just like I mentioned. Now, what's interesting is you can use task sequence bootstrapping separate and apart from autopilot. And we'll talk about autopilot coming up, right? Or you can use it in conjunction with autopilot, either way. So let's talk about that for a minute. Autopilot is that experience where you do effectively the same thing, right? The device has a generic operating system on it, and that operating system boots up and goes through the process of setup, and then part of that setup is to join into Intune, and then customizations can come down from Intune, right? Part of those customizations that can come down from Intune, like you will see, is that the Configuration Manager client can be installed from Intune, and then we can bootstrap the task sequence to do our baseline customizations of an autopilot build. We'll talk about that. But you don't have to use autopilot for this experience to be leveraged on your device. So I kind of think of it this way. You could have an autopilot-like experience without autopilot at all. I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying the experience could be very much an autopilot-like experience that you don't need autopilot to deliver. Now, there's some nuances in there, right? But the whole idea of autopilot is to get the device registered into Azure AD in various forms, get customizations put on the device, and you could do some similar things with this approach, right? So a lot of flexibility you get by looking at your options with task sequence bootstrapping. So again, task sequence bootstrapping requires a non-imaging task sequence. So this is not going to be a scenario that deploys an image from the task sequence onto the device. You need to have an operating system there already. And then it is all about rapid task sequence initiation. So the task sequence will be initiated as quickly as possible during client install, and you'll see that. When the client gets installed, there's a command line switch that we put on to identify what task sequence should be started. And as quickly as we can, when that client gets installed to a certain point, gets registered with ConfigMgr, we'll call out and run that task sequence, right? We don't wait on policy, no delay for collection evaluation, and so on. It just goes quickly. Right? A lot of these things will become more clear as we walk through this session. So why do we care? Well, again, rapid device provisioning, just talked about that. The ability to integrate into Autopilot will be very huge for a number of customers that are Configuration Manager customers today. And again, we'll have a scenario coming up on that in a bit. Flexible scenarios. So you can do this whether you're on-prem or whether you're remote and not on-prem and connected only by the Cloud Management Gateway. Now, little asterisks here. There are requirements for the Cloud Management Gateway to function properly. There's a number of options for ways to install the Cloud Management Gateway. I'm not dealing with those in this session. There is a separate session out on the web right now that I did a while back on configuring the Cloud Management Gateway in Configuration Manager. I go through all the options, so I'm not talking about it here. Just be aware, that I'm assuming a fully functional Cloud Management Gateway is deployed, however you deploy it, and I will just move on and show you in the demo, right? Okay, now, task sequence bootstrapping. What are the requirements? Already mentioned that you need a non-imaging task sequence deployed. You need that task sequence deployed, but it needs to be deployed to a specific collection, and I'll show you that as we go along. I probably also should say, I should have said already, but I'll say now, this session is based on Configuration Manager 2006, right? The task sequence bootstrapping capability was first introduced in Configuration Manager 2002. So was the bulk registration token that we'll talk about. So this will work in Configuration Manager 2002. Know that there's a bug, a couple of bugs, actually one bug in Configuration Manager 2002 that it doesn't work in all of the scenarios that I will show you here. And that's why I waited until 2006 to be able to do this video. But it was first introduced in 2002, just to let you know where we are and how we're recording this. Okay. And then I mentioned as a requirement, new device, and I put a question mark there, right? So whenever you're installing a new client, that's when the task sequence bootstrapping can happen, because that task sequence bootstrapping is defined on the command line. So whenever I was testing this and first playing with it, I at least questioned, does this need to be a client that has never been in the Configuration Manager console before? Or can it be a client that's just being reinstalled? It was a Configuration Manager system. It was being managed by Configuration Manager. Now it's being reinstalled for whatever reason. Will it work in those scenarios, right? Because I was thinking about unknown computers. Unknown computers, in order for them to be treated as unknown computers, cannot be known to Config Manager. So I just questioned here. And the answer is it doesn't really matter. The device can be in the Configuration Manager console. It can be absent from the Configuration Manager console. I've tested it both ways, and it works the same, right? Okay. Now, some terminology to level set on as we kind of trudge forward, right? Talked about these terms before, but I think it's a good time to just highlight a couple of things, right? So there is Azure AD Join. Azure AD Join is where your device is only joined to Azure AD. It is not joined to on-prem at all, right? Now, you don't have to choose one or the other to use task sequence bootstrapping. The reason I call it out is because of the autopilot scenario that's coming up, right? There are multiple ways to do autopilot, as I've covered in a previous video on autopilot. One is the Azure AD Join only, where the device only exists in Azure AD. The other is hybrid Azure AD Join, where the device is joined to on-prem AD and registered in Azure AD, so it exists in both places. There's a little bit of extra work that you have to do to set that up. In this session, I'm not going to deal with the hybrid Azure AD Join scenario because it works the same way as the Azure AD Join scenario, at least in terms of client bootstrapping. But I want you to understand there is that difference, right? And there's other things that kick in there as well. A big one is authentication, right? So authentication, when I'm talking about that, I talk about it in terms of authenticating to Configuration Manager, right? So there's differences when you're on-prem, and there's differences when you're connecting from remote through the Cloud Management Gateway, right? So first, we talk about certificates. So certificates are supported on any device that you want to communicate with Configuration Manager. In fact, even if you don't set up PKI, right? So you notice that there are two kinds of certificates. One is self-signed, the other is PKI, right? So you're always using certificates. Even if you don't know that you're using certificates, you are always using certificates because Configuration Manager leverages self-signed certificates to secure its communication in various ways, right? So self-signed certificates are going to work always on-prem, right? You can add PKI if you want that extra level of security with a locally issued or third-party issued certificate infrastructure. That will work and is fully supported on-prem as well as through the Cloud Management Gateway. But there are other ways that you can actually do authentication with the Cloud Management Gateway type scenarios. One is with Azure AD. Well, there's two kinds of Azure AD tokens. One is called a device token. The other is called the user token. So if the device is known to Azure AD, whether it is Azure AD joined or hybrid Azure AD joined, doesn't matter. If the device is known to Azure AD, it's going to have a device token. It's going to have a user token. We're going to discover that as part of managing the device, and then that token can be presented to the Cloud Management Gateway to authenticate the device is owned by your organization and should be allowed to talk with the Cloud Management Gateway. New in 2002, and we'll talk about here, is this thing called the bulk registration token. So let me lay this out a little bit different. So let me back up for a minute. So I mentioned certificates are supported on all supported devices. That's Windows 10, that's Windows 7, that's all the server versions that are supported, can be used to authenticate in all of those scenarios, right? Azure AD tokens, that's a Windows 10 thing only, right? Because only Windows 10 devices can be really joined. I guess that's really not true because you can join other devices to Azure AD. I guess I'll put an asterisk there. I've worked with Windows 10 devices, and so that's what I know that we can use to authenticate and truly have them joined to Azure AD or registered in Azure AD. I've not ever tried, I guess, a Windows 7 device or server device that's kind of visible in Azure AD, because there are ways to do that with those kind of operating systems. But the tokens typically are thought of associated with Windows 10, so I'll leave it that there. Then we have the bulk registration token that was added in Configuration Manager 2002, and that works with any supported device. Windows 10, Windows 7, well, Windows 7 is not supported anymore, but any of the server builds that are still supported works no problem for authentication through the Cloud Management Gateway at client install, right? So one thing I'm not talking about in this session other than right here is in Configuration Manager 2002, there is a new mechanism by which clients will receive a token and be able to renew that token through the management point automatically. You don't have to do a thing. And then when they move off-prem and communicate with the Cloud Management Gateway, they have that token. They can authenticate. The bulk registration token really comes into play if you're installing the client from the internet when it's not on-prem. So if it's on-prem, all of this negotiation of the token that's maintained happens automatically. If you're off-prem, then we have this bulk registration token that you can present to the Cloud Management Gateway that will allow that client to talk to the Cloud Management Gateway and get installed. Once the client's installed, all the token renewal and so on happens automatically, right? Anyway, so hopefully that makes sense. So those are kind of some terminology things I wanted to work through. Now, here are the scenarios that I want to talk through and demonstrate in the session today. First is working with a client on-prem. Now, remember, this session is focused on task sequence bootstrapping. To do the task sequence bootstrapping in all these scenarios, other things will need to come into play, like the bulk registration token in a minute. On-prem, all I'm going to do is install the client using the command line switch to call out to the task sequence to initiate it right away whenever things get started, right? Then I'm going to move to the cloud management gateway. This will be a scenario where the client is 100% on the internet, not on-prem at all, and fully has to install through the cloud management gateway. There we will use the bulk registration token. And then we'll move to an autopilot scenario with Azure AD join, user-driven, and we will show how that works there just to demonstrate it's just as applicable there as it is in the other scenarios. All right, so let's keep going. Okay, so first I want to show you how to go about configuring all of this to get things ready. So let me pull in the Configuration Manager server into the window here, and we'll just walk through a couple of things. Configuring this is really not difficult, right? The first thing that we need to do is go look at our task sequence. And I have a very, very, very basic task sequence that really doesn't do anything here that we can look at. So under Operating System, you'll see my task sequence down here. All right, and so this is basically for Autopilot. This is Autopilot is one scenario, but this is what I'm going to use. Let me pull this this up so we can see a little bit more detail. Right, so very, very, very simple task sequence here. Let me edit that. All right, so all this is going to do is set a task sequence variable, install an application, and then we're done, right? So not a huge deal at all. This task sequence is deployed. So here is the package ID, but don't get tripped up here. This is not what we want. What we want, what we need, well, let me show you the deployment first. So this is deployed, and it's deployed to a collection that's new in Configuration Manager 2002 and is required for this task sequence bootstrapping called all provisioning devices. So it is deployed. It's deployed as required. Here's the truth. I think it makes sense to deploy this as required because you do, in fact, want this to run immediately whenever you install the client. So in my mind, it makes sense. I've deployed it available, and it works just the same way. I just like to kind of match the way it's deployed to my intended use. So in my case, it's required, but in my testing, it doesn't really matter, right? So it's deployed here. Now, the way that you actually will call out on the command line to this task sequence is not by package ID. Instead, it's by deployment ID. Wrong place, sorry. Deployment ID here. Right, so you will need this deployment ID. It's not by default in the view. This one over here, SAP2000C is mine. You will know you have the deployment ID if you have the number 2 right after your site code, because that's kind of the way we structure deployment IDs, right? So that's the task sequence itself, and again, deployed to the all provisioning devices collection and grabbing the deployment ID. Now, let me use this opportunity also to remind you that, again, we are focused on, let me take this out of the screen for a minute. We are focused on Configuration Manager 2006, right? Again, I mentioned this was first introduced in Configuration Manager 2002. I mentioned there was a bug there, and here's the bug, right? So this whole scenarios, all these things that I'm talking about will work beautifully in Configuration Manager 2002 if you have certificate authentication using PKI generated certs being leveraged for communication throughout, right? Now, some scenarios don't need it. Like on-prem, you don't need to worry about PKI generated certs, and so it just works normally, on-prem. It really gets into focus whenever you try to use Azure AD tokens or the bulk registration token to install a client completely on the internet. There, you're going to see some failures if you're trying to also deploy applications as part of your task sequence and so on, right? In 2006, all of those are supported now. That bug is fixed. That's why I waited until 2006 to record this video specifically. So that's how you set it up. Again, it's really not a challenge to set up. It's pretty straightforward to look at. One thing I didn't show you, let me just pull back in the Configuration Manager site server for just a sec. There it is. right? I showed you this was deployed to all provisioning devices. Let me show you over in Assets and Compliance two things. My console is going to close on me. I think it does that sometimes whenever I maximize the screen. Just a minute. Okay, launch it again. So I want to show you the actual collection, right? So I've shown you that it's deployed to the all provisioning devices collection. I did not actually show you the collection. Here it is. Right? So in 2002, you will see that you now have the all provisioning devices collection. You'll see that I have one member, right? So you don't expect the membership to be more than that. So at least it just has that one. And then I mentioned that I'm going to be able to do this with devices that already exist in Configuration Manager. That's true. Here's one of them I'm going to use. Here's another one that I will use and install from the internet. I think that's the right machine. Anyway, right? So that's pretty easy setup, not real challenging at all. Right? So just, and I want to say it again. I've already told you, but sometimes saying it a couple of times helps, drive home the point. A word about tokens, right? Again, if you're installing the Configuration Manager client on-prem, the client will automatically be provisioned with a token. You don't have to worry about it. It will then renegotiate with the management point and maintain that token. So whether it's communicating on-prem, off-prem, we'll still be able to communicate with that management point without it, or the Cloud Management Gateway, no problem, right? Now, if you're installing the Config Manager client from the internet using the Cloud Management Gateway from the start, that's where you need to go and install or generate this bulk registration token that the client can then use. Now, a couple of interesting things about the bulk registration token. It is a very short-lived token, right? It will only live up to 7 days, and then it will expire and need to be regenerated. That's a security thing, just to make sure that the bulk registration token doesn't stay out there forever and so on. So if you're using that, just know that it will need to be regenerated. That could be interesting in an autopilot scenario, right? We'll get to that in a bit. Now, let me show you how you would go through and generate the bulk registration token, because I know that mine is out of date. Let me go ahead and pull back in the Configuration Manager console. All right, so I'm going to launch command prompt. I'm going to do it as admin because that's a good habit. Command launch that as admin. Great. And I'm going to navigate into the Configuration Manager directory. One moment while I do that. There we go. And the utility to do this is under bin and x64. And so what I'm going to use is, let me just show you. So here's the utility, bulk registration token tool, right? So what I'm going to do is run this bulk registration token tool, and I'm just going to use the command line new. And what it's going to do is go out and configure a new bulk registration token for me. Now there's other command line options that you could use there as well. So let me see, I don't even know if the question mark is supported here. Let me just even see if it is. Yeah, so you can say the question mark here, the lifetime is the other switch where you can specify how long you can make it live. Default is 3 days, so mine is only going to live for 3 days. I'm going to copy this off to Notepad real quick. Let me just make sure I get the exact bulk registration token. And this is what I will use in a minute whenever I go use the bulk registration token to install from the internet. So we go ahead and copy that off, and I will store this in Notepad on my machine. And in 1 second, while I do that, I'll be right. Okay, so I've got it on Notepad. I'll use that again here in a minute. Generating the bulk registration token, not that big a deal, right? One of the things I mentioned that you'll have to deal with this with Autopilot. If you're going to use this bulk registration token with Autopilot, one of the things you'll have to do is regenerate that token every so often. There's automated ways that you could do that, and then use that with Autopilot. I'll try to remember to talk through that a little bit more once we get to that Autopilot scenario, right? So that's generating the bulk registration token. So now we're totally configured. We're ready to go. All right, so let's step in and see this thing happen in action, right? Okay, so the first scenario I'm going to show you is using task sequence bootstrapping on-prem. I want to show you how that works, right? So I kind of try to lay it out here. The first thing is we're going to have a baseline task sequence prepared and deployed to the all provisioning collection. I've shown you that I have that. The task sequence deployment ID is going to be noted and used with that command line whenever I call out to that task sequence. So I haven't shown you that yet, but the command line switch specifically is going to be provision TS equals and the deployment ID that you lifted out of the configuration manager console. Once that happens, then the client install is going to be initiated using that provision TS command line switch, and you're going to specify in the deployment ID. You can watch this happen, all the client install happen and calling out to the task sequence in the CCM setup log. You'll see the deployment ID is passed to CCM setup.exe, which passes it to the client MSI, and then finally the client gets installed. When the client first starts to come up, CCMexec is going to call out to TS agent, and that's going to initiate the task sequence. You'll be able to see that in TS agent log, and then finally you'll see the standard SMS TS log as things get started, right? Okay, so let's take a look at this. So to do that, I have one of my VMs that does not have the client installed, right? This is the on-prem. Oops, can't talk and type at the same time apparently. Stand by. There we go. Oops. Interesting. Let me fix that real quick. I'll be right back. All right, so let's try that again. My snapshot that I was using for this was, I guess, old enough that it broke the trust relationship, but I just disjoined and rejoined to the domain. So let's see how this works now. So this is a VM that I know doesn't have the client installed and was cleaned up and all from a previous client install. So trying to use this one. Okay, so let's just verify, right? So in the control panel, come on, a little bit slow as it's first starting up. Then we'll be able to confirm that there is no configuration manager client installed here at all. If I go to the disk itself, then I will be able to see that the configuration manager client files are not here either. Right? So Windows. Now here's the CCM folder. You don't see CCM setup or CCM cache. In here you just have this one folder that has some kind of strange permissions. I might even be able to delete it now. I don't know. Yeah, it's still blocked, but that's okay, right? So the client's really not here. So what I'm going to do is go and install the client. Let me go ahead and launch the command prompt and navigate to my desktop and then the client folder, right? And so it's very simple, CCM setup, and I'm just going to use a very simple command line, SMS site code equal SAP. Oh, before I do that, let me just confirm that I can get to my site. So in fact, that is my site server. It's also my management point. So off we go. CCM setup, SMS site code equal SAP, SMS MP equal srvcm sa.tailspintoys.com. And then here's our command line switch. Provision TS equal, and then SAP 2000 Charlie. Right, let me just review that for typos. CCM setup, SMS site code SAP, SMS MP, lab serve, CMSA, tailspintoys.com. Provision, so that should be correct. I'm just going to go ahead and initiate that. So real exciting, right, to watch the client install. But now what I'm going to do is come over to that folder and just watch things progress. Right, now I'm probably not going to make you sit here and watch the whole thing. I'll pause this creatively just so you see the progress. So here is CCM setup. So CCM setup, let's just confirm that it's off and running. So here's the log. We can see some indication that it's doing its thing already. So it's rolling, right? I just saw this other one come in, so I know this is rolling. Let's go ahead and verify that we have CCM, and it's starting to grow. So we're just waiting here again. I'll pause this creatively and let you see this in a kind of an accelerated way. So let me pause it the first time right now, and I'll be right back as we see some change. Okay, so we just got these in, right? And I'm going to go into the logs directory because that's where I'm going to park for a minute. And so we'll just wait and watch for the logs to build. And I want the early stages of the logs to start to show up whenever I have things like client ID, manager startup and things. That's what I'm waiting for. And here's going to be the real key. Whenever you have a healthy client registration, you're going to have about right at a 60-second delay, maybe longer, but generally if you have good connectivity, a 60-second delay where the client install process parks and waits. This will not kick off until after that 60-second delay. So you can kind of predict at earliest when this is going to happen. It'll be pretty darn quick after that 60-second delay. But now you just see a couple of logs starting to pile in. You'll see the client ID manager startup. So it's going through its iterations, right? So I'll wait for a minute and you'll hopefully see the 60-second delay, and then we'll wait for that to come back in. So let me just click on that for a minute. So, okay, so we're still waiting. We just wait for that a bit longer. Check it again. And yes, this is Notepad to read the logs. Okay, so unchanged, executing registration task, almost there. It's probably there. There it is, that fast, right? Here it comes. Didn't have to wait at all. We're running the task sequence, right? So you saw very early on this. Let me explain that one then. So I had the 60-second delay is for a client that is not registered, that it has to wait and get confirmed with the site. As I recall, this one is registered, as you'll see in the client ID manager startup log. There was no reason to wait. So here it is. Client is set. Let's see. Executing registration task. Client should be registered already. Yeah. It's already registered. Didn't have to really delay at all. There's no 60-second delay there. You see the task sequence running that fast. That's all I wanted to show you for this scenario. Now, what I want to do is go show you in some of these logs how to kind of trace this through, right? So I won't do this for every single one because it gets repetitive. But now that we have this one, let's go look at the CCM setup logs. And specifically, in the CCM setup log, right here, open that up. Let's just search top down. And I'm looking for CCM setup command line. That's what I'm going to key off of in the log, right? So first iteration of it there, right? So I see, in fact, I can confirm here that the provision TS command line switch was actually part of the command line that was absorbed by CCM setup, right? You just typed it in, so you know it is, but still good to be able to see it here. From there, the process hands off to CCM setup.msi. And so if we open that particular log right here, right, again, Notepad is our friend, and search down, then we can confirm that the command line got passed into here as well. So let's just look for command line. There we go. All right. So now the command line gets tweaked a little bit, but you can scroll on over and see provision TS did actually pass its way in to CCM setup.msi. Now the next one along the way, the client's going to get installed. And so we want to go into, so here we go. You see the client's just coming up like normal now, right? So in the CCM exec log right here, if you go look for, let me maximize this, edit find. All right, so TS invoking system task, TS, let me just try with that real quick. Okay, so I'm just going to go through it a couple of times and hopefully get to it here in just a minute. Okay, fine, I'll finish searching for it. TS agent pre-startup. Okay, there we go, right? So that is your clue that we're doing a pre-startup, a startup before a normal client would do it prior to 2002, right? We're kicking in, reading that command line, and so on. And from there, all we're doing is reaching out and running the task sequence as normal. We have the SMSTS log. You saw the task sequence run. So here's our TS log. And you know that this ran, well, first of all, you saw it. But if you look in this log, you can see preparing policy assignment request. And there's a lot before that, but here's that part. Early on in the log, preparing policy assignment request against the site. Off we go. We're going to download things and run just like normal, right? Okay, so this is our on-prem scenario, if you will. Okay, pretty easy using it in just a standard client install command line, so good to go, right? Okay, now the next one is installing from the Cloud Management Gateway. The client is not on-prem at all, is going to do all of its gyrations through the Cloud Management Gateway. First, let's see how this works. So very similar, a little bit different. So again, we have the task sequence prepared. It's deployed with the deployment ID. We have that. The client command line switch is going to include the provision TS just like before. The difference here is that when you launch the client install on the device, your command line is going to look similar to this. Notice that I have references to my Cloud Management Gateway in here. I'm still calling the provision TS just like normal. The troubleshooting through this is just like normal. It's just whenever the client tries to go and communicate, instead of an on-prem management point, we're going to be using the Cloud Management Gateway as our management point and authenticate here. Now, this is where that authentication gets into play. Either you're going to use certificates, which works beautifully in Configuration Manager 2002, or you're going to want to use the Azure AD authentication, which is the device token or the user token, probably the device token, or the bulk registration token. The bulk registration token and Azure AD do not work in 2002. They will work in 2006, right? That's why I'm using 2006, right? Okay, so this is kind of the process of how it works. Now, let's go see this happen in action, all right? So there's two scenarios here. I'm going to do one client install with the Azure AD token, right? Because this device is one that is joined to Azure AD. And I'm going to log in with an account that is replicated to Azure AD. Then I'm going to do another scenario with the bulk registration token. Let me grab my VM that I'm going to use for testing. So this is a machine that is purely connected to the internet. I'm logged on with an Azure AD user. So let me just show you. So if I go to my command prompt and do who am I? Who am I? You already see it here kind of, but you don't know you see it there. So you see that I'm logged on with an Azure AD account. So that fact is required so that I can use Azure AD authentication, right? The Azure AD token. And so what I'm going to do is just simply navigate in and install the client. So let me just go in. And by the way, before I do that, I'll just confirm. So I cannot ping. I showed you I could do this before on-prem. Here I can't because I'm not on-prem. I'm on the internet only, right? So all I'm going to do is initiate the client install. I'm going to grab this from my clipboard, save me some typing. So I'm going to do CCM setup, and I'm going to paste this in. Same effective command line, just now referencing the Cloud Management Gateway, right? So my MP is my Cloud Management Gateway. I'm still joining my site code, and I'm telling it no CRL check. That's a Cloud Management Gateway configuration, and I'm going to be launching this task sequence with provision TS. So I'm going to go ahead and allow that to run, say yes, and off we go, right? So waiting on this, and let's go into the logs and kind of watch what's going on. Oops, I clicked the right place. All right, so here, Windows, CCM setup, yeah, and logs. So we can just watch this. Scroll down. Interesting. So we actually got a failure. Let me go check that out and see why, and I will be right back. Okay, apologies. I found out what that was. Actually, that was my mistake. Clearly, this is a new VM, and what I did not have is the trusted root certificate added to the trusted store. So whenever my client went and tried to communicate with the Cloud Management Gateway, it did not have authentication to do so, right? So I'm using an on-prem certificate authority. If you're using a third-party certificate authority, you wouldn't have to worry about that. Again, that's Cloud Management Gateway stuff that I'm not going to worry about, but we can see that the client install is kicking along, no problem, no errors, right? So now we're just connecting to the server. We're going to download some things. We got our next log, so everything's starting to come down. No issue. So I'm going to shift over to the CCM directory once it gets here, and we will monitor it like before. So again, I'm going to creatively use pause so that you don't have to watch through the whole process, and you'll see the relevant parts. So I will be right back when the CCM folder is here and we start to build. Okay, so the CCM folder just showed up, and so we have all this going on. That's great. So like before, we'll go into the logs directory and we'll just monitor for this. It shouldn't take a great deal of time, but I'll go back on pause while the logs build up. There's an additional log, going back on pause. Some additional logs building in here. Now, one thing I should tell you, this is a brand new client to Configuration Manager. And so here we should see the delay as we have to register with Client ID Manager Startup. So we'll watch for that. There'll be a 60-second delay. Let me just see where we are with this process right now. So let's scroll down. Okay, so still waiting a little bit. All right, let's add in some more. Let's just quickly see. Executing registration task. Let's see, we should be almost there. Saw another log or two pop in. Okay, so I don't see the sleeping for 60 seconds yet, but it should be here very soon. Right? There it goes, sleeping for 60 seconds. So I will pause this and be right back whenever we continue. Okay, so coming up on that 60 seconds, should be moving on pretty quickly here. So we'll just kind of sit and monitor for things. Here we go. There's the SMSTS log. You saw it pop in. So provision TS is definitely kicking off. And then we'll watch and see if the task sequence initiates. It should. Let's just see. So give it a second. All right. It went ahead and moved on. So it didn't actually pop up anything. That's interesting. Let's go look at the task sequence log and see what's up with that. I've seen it sometimes pop up and just not have enough time, or it might have ended. But let's go look for policy. So no execution request for, do that again. Downloading policy. So it did actually start to get it, right? So you saw that the TS came up, and let's successfully read policies. Let's just scroll down, make sure that we're not getting any particular error. So we had an error initializing task sequence environment. So processing 0 locations, that's for the content stuff. So that's my fault. It doesn't have the error that I would expect for if this bug was out there. Here's where you would see the bug right here. So if it was not able to proceed, you would get an error in here. That's not what happened. And so it was trying to find a location request apparently for this, and it's not able to. I'm not sure why, but probably because I don't have the content out on the cloud distribution point. My fault again. I will go correct that. Be before I run this again. In fact, what I'm going to do is just take the application call out of the task sequence. It'll make it run faster anyway. But that completes the scenario here for using Azure AD token to communicate with just the Cloud Management Gateway to install the client. What I'm going to do next is remove the client here, reset everything just like what you saw here. I'm going to go edit the task sequence so the task sequence doesn't have any content in it, doesn't need an application or whatever. It's just going to run quickly. And then we'll do this with the bulk registration token. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off the uninstall. And we'll pause the video here, and I will be right back when I'm ready to kick off the bulk registration token piece of this. Okay, so the system has been restored. No client is on here. Now, I am still logged on with an account that is part of Azure AD. Let me be very specific. With the bulk registration token, that is not required, right? Because that's what the bulk registration token is for. So I'm going to specify it on the command line. It doesn't really matter what account I'm logged on as at this stage. So let me just show you, though, that the client is not here. And by the way, I did make the adjustment to the task sequence so that it only is going to set a variable instead of try to run an application. And so all of that is gone, right? So let's go ahead and try to initiate the client install, this time using the bulk registration token. And full disclosure, I copied off the bulk registration token to Notepad, and then I closed Notepad without having the bulk registration token saved, and so I had to quickly go regenerate the bulk registration token. So if it looks different to you than what I copied before, that's because it is. So it's a same effect, just a different token, right? Okay, so now let me go into where I was. In here, there, great, and there, right? So CCM setup this time. CCM setup this time, the command line will be similar, but we'll use the bulk registration token for authentication. I'm going to paste that in, right? Now I need to make sure and clean up any spaces and so on so that this works. Looks like I have a space in here that I did not intend. So let me just backspace quickly and get to where I want to be. Stand by. Stand by while the cursor goes backwards for a minute. Almost there. Oh, I see what's going on. Okay, sorry. Let me do this. Let me do this differently. All right, hang on. I'm gonna pause this and be back. Stand by. I realized I had a space in what I was trying to paste, so it makes it easier to just do it again and get rid of that space over in Notepad. So let me just paste that in. Okay, great. So I pasted it in. I've kicked off the process, and so basically I'm still referencing my Cloud Management Gateway. I'm setting my site code to SAP. I'm doing the NoCRL check, referencing my provision TS. Here's my reg token that I'm supplying. And so now authentication should be completely happening with the reg token. Let's go look at CCM setup and make sure that we're progressing through here. Okay, looks like we probably are. Let's see. Just don't want to see a failure. Okay, good. So we are progressing. And so as before, I will creatively use the pause command on the video so you don't have to watch the full length of what's going on. But yeah, we're progressing. So let me pause the video. I'll come back at the relevant part. Okay, so the CCM folder just showed up, and we're starting to build into that. Let's look at our logs, and like before, we'll wait for more logs to appear, and we're starting to build a couple of more. Okay, so now what I didn't do is actually clean up the device from ConfigMgr, so we may very well bypass the registration and be pretty quick at this stage. So we'll just kind of leave things cooking along here and see what's going on. Let me just open up Client ID Manager Startup. I don't believe that we'll have to register this time. Looks like maybe not. Let's see. I definitely don't want to miss the SMSTS. Let me scroll this down to the bottom. Okay, there's the TS log, just showed up. So it did its thing, just like it was supposed to with the provision TS command. And now that I'm just setting a variable, this may just go so quickly that we don't see anything. Let's see. So this is doing its thing. All right, so we know it's working. Okay, there it comes, right? So we saw the task sequence just did a variable, no big deal, but you see that in fact it worked. The only difference is this time I used the bulk registration token to provide authentication to the Cloud Management Gateway. This is something, again, you can do. Doesn't have to be an Azure AD joined machine at all. This one happens to be, but it doesn't have to be at all, right? So let me pull this out of the equation, and we will move on, right? Okay, looks like I went back. That's where I wanted to be. So on we go, right? Autopilot. So this is the autopilot, demonstrating how to do this through autopilot is really important, because one of the things ConfigMgr customers will want to do is be able to use this provision task sequence bootstrapping to do the specialization of autopilot devices. So one of the customers I work with specifically is doing this, right? And it makes a ton of sense. So Intune is amazing, and being able to use autopilot to get you to Intune, to be able to do some things through Intune is awesome. But one of the things Intune can't do right now is do specific order of operations of when things are going to get put on the device, right? That is a perfect scenario for a task sequence. And so the idea is that we'll autopilot the device. The first thing we'll do is install the ConfigMgr client on the device through autopilot, through Intune, and then the device will get the ConfigMgr client installed like you've seen. It will call the task sequence like you've seen, and now the device will be co-managed between Intune and Configuration Manager. Here's a bit about how it works. So same kind of deal. We're going to do the task sequence and have the provision TS. We're going to call out. Through this, we're going to launch the client install. The client gets authenticated through that process, through autopilot, and we just get loaded. So let's go see specifically how this works. Actually, a word about this kind of as we get started, right? So one of the things we're going to need to do, and I'll show you what it looks like in a minute, but one of the things we're going to need to do is configure the ConfigMgr client install through Intune in order to get the bootstrapping process kicked off, right? Now, if you look at our documentation for how to go about installing the ConfigMgr client through Autopilot, it will suggest to you to use a line of business application, which is an option in Intune. In fact, let me just pull up Intune for a second. Pull that in here. Okay, so here's Intune, and just real quick, right? If you go to apps here, I'm going to specifically filter on Windows apps, right? So there's a couple of client installs that I have here, right? And so this is my Windows MSI. This would be my line of business application, right? So if I go into this, I can look at properties of it and so on, and I can see the command line structure that is used and so on. And this is great, right? But this is only great if you use Azure AD tokens. In the autopilot world, Azure AD tokens are not reliable if you're using hybrid Azure AD join. The reason for that is because in the hybrid Azure AD join process, the device will need to reboot, and that Azure AD token will get destroyed and have to be regenerated. Timing-wise, it's not going to be reliable to have that be the authentication mechanism. So the recommendation there is, in a hybrid Azure AD join scenario, is to use bulk registration token, because you can just present that on the command line. But here's the problem, right? Notice what happens if I go use the bulk registration token. So I'm just going to edit this, right? And so here, I'm just going to copy and paste in the command line I just used. Let me do that. Okay, cool. CCM setup command, all in here. Great. Paste. Oops. Come on. If I can get that here, I'll just paste it in, doesn't really matter. So I didn't do this in the right format, but I did enough to show you the point. With that bulk registration token, I can't put it in. The maximum command line length is 1024 characters, if I remember right. With the bulk registration token, I'm a little bit like 2004 characters, and so immediately I cannot use the line of business application approach. And so the next thing that you would think is, okay, great. So you can't use that. Let's go try to use a Win32 application. Okay, good idea. All right, let's go do that. And so I have a Win32 application here as well. In fact, I have two of them. I'll explain to you why I have two of them here in just a second. So here's ConfigMgr for Autopilot. I believe this is the one where I'm just trying to call CCM setup directly. So let me see. Where is it? Yeah, so this is where I'm calling CCM setup directly. I just did this for some testing. But here's the point. I can actually put in the command line. Let me show you. So I can go put in the command line here. No problem. Let me go forward to the program. So I'll paste in the same command line right here. And this is going to be the real one that I would use, right? And so I get no errors at all about command line length. I just lets me go on. I'll even put in CCM setup. Great. And so the thought is that this looks like it's going to work, right? Okay, great. So let's keep going. And so we'll move on to requirements. We'll have to click through the rest of these, no issue. And then I'll review this and I will try to save it. I must have had to click through here. Let me go back. Program, I'll do this the slow way. At the bottom, review and save. Review and save. Just a second. Review and save. Right. Okay, here I am. So I'm going to try to save this, thinking, okay, the command line's here. Everything is good. Let's go and save this. And I'm going to save it, and immediately I can't do it. It took me a little bit to figure out what this was telling me. And what I found out is if I just simply go back and make the command line shorter, I don't have this problem, right? So I'll just show you real quick. I'll just get rid of it. That's far shorter than I would have to make it, but just to give you an example, right? So move this on down and such, review and save, do that again. And now when I try to save it, it's going to save no problem, right? So the error is misleading, but whenever I saw that, I'm like, well, maybe it is the command line. I changed it, no problem. So the Win32 directly calling CCM setup.exe is not going to work either with the bulk registration token. So what I need to do is instead, I used an app that is still using Win32 application, but now I'm calling PowerShell directly, right? Or I'm using PowerShell to call a PowerShell script that I then specify the bulk registration token and the command line. Now, using the Win32 app, what you have to do is wrap the application. There's a process for that. I go through it in my client app videos. I'm not going to spend the time on it here, but I wanted to show you that process and how it works, because if you don't have that, then the bulk registration token is going to be a bit challenging, right? So let me go ahead and move on and show you how this works with Autopilot. Actually, before I do that, let me show you one other thing. Oh, and I just noticed actually that all of my slides, when I say in action, they say on-prem. Sorry, that was a oversight, but you know that we did on-prem cloud management gateway, and now we're doing Autopilot. So hopefully that is not distracting. But I want to show you one other thing. I'm actually currently uploading a new version of the client install with the latest bulk registration token. So that's what that is going on in the background. But this is assigned to my group. Let me get down here. Okay, so I've got my Autopilot devices group. Again, this is not an Autopilot discussion, but this is assigned to my Autopilot devices group. So whenever my device autopilots, it will be a part of that group. It will get this application, and that's where the ConfigMgr client will get installed. And so I'm going to wait for this to finish up, then I will go ahead and launch. In fact, I'll go ahead and start the autopilot process now, because it'll take a minute before it gets to this section. So let me pull in the autopilot machine. So it's coming up. I'm not going to make you walk through this whole process with me. I'll just show you the precursor stages that you would expect from autopilot. Then I'll pause the video. Once the autopilot process completes and the client is installed, then I will show you that as well, and we will move on and start to wrap up the session. So let this come up, and we will go about doing our thing here in just a minute. Okay, great. So now it's moving on. We should get our sign-in screen here shortly for tailspintoys.com, which tells me that it did get the autopilot deployment profile, and we should be good to go. So let's stand by for that. Okay, so we have our prompt, welcome to Tailspin Toys. So I know that it got the autopilot profile, no problem. Let's go ahead and sign in. And again, this is not at all an autopilot discussion. This is only an autopilot discussion because there will be folks that want to use the client bootstrapping process with autopilot. So I just want to demonstrate that it does work. So I've just signed in. The autopilot process is kicking off, doing its thing. And so now I'm going to pause the video. I'll come back whenever we are all done and show you the process is complete. All right, so the process finished. I'm not going to make you go through the whole thing again, but just to show you, here's the client, the setup files are all there, and the client definitely installed, the task sequence ran. It is exactly the same as it would be in a non-autopilot scenario. It's just now that the client is being delivered from Intune, getting installed. Now the task sequence runs. Now you have that order of operation that you want, right? Alrighty. So let's start working through the end of this. So talk about some troubleshooting tips and tricks. A couple of thoughts, right? So I shared with you that the way this works is that when the client gets installed, CCMexec will actually initiate the task sequence by using reaching out and launching it with TSP. You can actually do that yourself, right? So for example, let me just show you real quick. I'll just pull in my site server. It doesn't really matter. I'm just going to pull up and show you the command line. So one of the ways that you can actually simulate what's going to happen with Provision TS, you can actually call a command line. So if you do TSP launch, now it's not in the right directory here, but if you do TSP launch from inside the ConfigMgr client, whatever, and then specify TS deployment ID, can't talk and type at the same time, colon, and then in my case, as I recall, it was SAP 2000C, then that will actually run and install the task sequence just like it would if it were done through autopilot. You will see it run through, right? It's a really cool way to simulate the task sequence execution. So keep that in the back of your pocket, kind of as a troubleshooting option. And then one other thing that I think is interesting with this. So we live in the world now where we are building and using lots and lots and lots of virtual machines. So I use one of my customers' scenario as an example. They build a lot of servers, and they used to build them on-prem with ConfigMgr task sequencing, and now that they're moving into the cloud and Azure and different places, different data centers, whatever, using a ton of VMs, even on-prem, wherever, they want a way to be able to have the beauty of quickly building these VMs from a base OS, but being able to specialize them like they would traditionally with task sequencing. And so here's a really cool way. You can use this provision TS command in the command line through basically some startup commands and some different kickoffs that you could do with virtual machines. It's a little bit different depending on the virtual machine and how you do it, but you effectively can initiate the client install from an automated interface when you build these VMs, and it'll install the client. It will then kick off your task sequence. It will then specialize it just like you're used to having happen, and it's just not a big deal, right? And so that's also interesting. I just mentioned that for you because because it could be interesting in your scenario. And really, that's it, right? That's what I wanted to show you. I appreciate you hanging out. Check this out. It's really cool, very powerful, gives you a lot of flexibility. We will end the session here, and we will see you next time.